the game. Or playing the game, excuse me.
Pretty telling when companies like this are unable to make a diverse game, without also making it feel so shallow and fake. After all, there's been many games that have actually...
And the entire thing is shallow and fake, not just the woke content. The entire thing
included a very diverse cast of characters. And it turns out when the games aren't so preachy about the whole thing, it comes off much more natural, and those games often find far more success. Another clip that's going viral in gaming circles is this one.
I'm from Ravane.
I haven't seen this
Not
one.
like I follow the Cune.
You've got the arm ropes.
Sure. I wear a lot of stuff. You don't get to tell me who I am.
Yeah, Mom. Yeah, I'll wear whatever the hell I want. I'm in 8th grade now. I don't believe in Jesus. Get out of my room. You don't know me.
Doesn't matter anyway. The Anton don't follow the Cune either.
Oh, God.
Not anymore.
A Dragon Age fan, or perhaps now an ex-Dragon Age fan, would say, man, that second clip makes me mad. The Cune is what made the Qunari so interesting. Another post reading, nothing screams a fantasy world more than modern-day gender lingo. How did gaming get here? The provided screenshot shows Tosh saying, non-binary, I just said. I'm going to use they instead of she from now on. Back to the topic of the review embargo, as well as what some people are saying about the reviews. Around 6 hours ago, Fextra Life posted a very interesting video about the game.
We watched this the
he
other
opens
day.
by talking about their history of covering Dragon Age content, including saving the BioWare forums and being in contact.
I've seen a lot of discourse surrounding my coverage of this topic, and all of the discourse around my coverage of the topic, I'm fairly certain that every person who's made an angry tweet about it, I don't think that a single one of them actually watched the video. Because like all the comments were like, oh, he's just saying it's woke. Oh, it's because it's woke. I don't know. Maybe you can go to like the video transcription. I'd be surprised if woke was in there more than one time. And probably the one time it's in there, it's probably me saying this isn't because it's woke. It had literally nothing to do with that. But people are losing their minds over that video. Never mentioned, I didn't even talk about that. It wasn't even a point. It had nothing to do with it.
Constant communication with EA and BioWare for years. EA had also invited them to attend the official Veilguard preview event back in September.
Right.
And after attending the event and playing the game there, they made their impressions video. In their preview video, they were essentially cautiously optimistic, enjoying some things about Veilguard, but also critiquing other things like the character designs and models.
In general, it was a pretty positive impression of the video, and I want to play for you the closing audio from that video right now so you can see what we told our audience at the end of that video. I still have issues with the game, mainly that I don't like the UI and that the dialogues didn't seem to be on par with what you could get in other story-focused games.
There's actually dialogue in the game about mother pressuring a non-binary character to wear a dress, so you were spot on. But if they were non-binary, I mean, like, there's like kilts in like Scottish culture already. Like, it's just sad. It's really just sad. Tread lightly. No, I know that. Like, my neighbor wears a kilt sometimes. I've seen him. Walking around a kilt. I've seen it multiple times. Like, it's for sure.
Out in the last decade, and that I didn't yet get a point where I felt a bond or much interest with my companions who were integral to the story. It's funny that I have pretty much been playing these games for the story and getting through the combat, but I may actually be playing the Veilguard to enjoy the combat and get through the story to see the end. How everything works together and progresses into a full game remains to be seen, and there were several big and impactful events that I cannot discuss, but so far my opinion on this has become more positive, and I would like to urge anyone who loves CRPGs to hang in there and wait for reviews and not write the game off just yet.
The point he's making is that their first impressions video was extremely mild, and some people even said that if anything, they were being too positive about the game. And yet
Yeah.
it seems like that very impressions
remember
video
seeing
actually
that.
upset EA, as after that video was released, they entirely ceased communications with Vextralife. Vextralife then reached out to other contacts to try and figure out what was going on, and they found out that them and apparently some other creators as well were getting fake assurances from EA that they would be given a code for the game to access it early in order to put out an early review. It turns out that that wasn't the case, as the codes never came, and the communications continued to cease. This is
It's impossible to be certain that the communication shutdown was as a result of the review, but it does seem to be it is a bad correlation to draw that a number of people who after the preview event expressed criticism and skepticism towards the game, that all three of those people did not receive codes to review the game. That is extremely concerning. Now, does that guarantee that that's what happened? It does not. But that's 3 points on a graph, and it makes a pretty straight line.
Similar to the situation that we discussed just the other day regarding Wolfheart FPS. Interestingly enough, a Spanish trader had reported that she actually lied to BioWare, telling them that she's non-binary. And believe it or not, she actually did receive a code. Someone had responded to her tweet in the included images, saying 0 time played seemed a little sus though, to which she responded with a clown emoji and showed that she actually now has an hour and a half played, proving that she does indeed have access to the game before its official release. Apparently, BioWare had actually retaliated against her over this entire situation, as she showed evidence that she had received a DMCA strike, going on to say that the tweet that was hit was the one where she was talking about receiving that code from BioWare. However, she went on to appeal the strike, Twitter seemingly taking her side and releasing her account. Now returning to Vextralife.
What the fuck is going on? That's so confusing. I wonder what... Like, it's such a weird situation. I wonder what's real.
In the context of their most recent video on Veilguard, the one where he talks about not receiving a code to get that early review out, well, he goes on to make a very compelling argument about why EA is operating in such a manner, basically claiming that this is a way for them to manipulate the upcoming reviews and ensure that most of the early reviews are going to be positive ones. This would then also allow them to manipulate the sentiment around the...
Which, to be fair, this is one thing, I'll say it again, and again, we cannot be sure about this, but when coincidence and personal gain converge, your skepticism goggles should be on. Oftentimes, that convergence is not a coincidence. You just accidentally do something that's in your benefit. Of course, that happens sometimes, but that should not be where you start from.
Game, making it seem overly positive around the time of release, with the ultimate goal of having boosted sales.
Because you guys told us in no uncertain terms that you're waiting for reviews.
Of course.
You're about to get a bunch of reviews that have been curated by the publisher for their likelihood of being extremely positive in an attempt to manipulate your view of Dragon Age: The Veilguard. They want you to think there is a universal consensus that the game is amazing, thereby convincing you that you should try it, but also influencing future review scores, as it's difficult to be the outlier. So if you see a bunch of...
You don't want to be the guy that gives it a 3 when everybody else gives it a 7, an 8, or a 9. You don't want to be that person, because if you are, now you could be the one that, like, you're not playing ball, you're not playing on the game.
Positive review scores come out today, think about all the people that are going to be playing afterward and how much pressure they're going to feel, give the game a slightly better score than they would have given it, just to avoid maybe some undue pressure.
I already talked about this the other day.
Sometimes that doesn't even happen consciously. It's just done subconsciously. And I want to be very clear here that I don't think that the press and creators publishing their videos early are going to be lying. However, these reviewers have been screened to maximize the chances that you're seeing positive reviews. There will probably be some exceptions, of course. I don't think everyone's going to give the game a positive review. But EA is banking that those are few and far between.
They're playing on probabilities.
In an attempt
of course.
to keep the aggregate score of the game high.
Once again, I do think he's making a very compelling argument as to the potential logic behind EA's actions. However, I myself am also a bit more cynical, it seems. While I'm sure that there are going to be people who genuinely do enjoy the game, including some who are reviewing it, I absolutely do think that there are going to be some people who are lying about just how much they enjoyed the game. It goes without saying that we can call such people shills. I'd also like to go back to Wolfheart FPS's tweet once again, but here's why. Some of the responses to it are extremely amusing and contradict some of the very reasonable logic that we already talked about analyzing the entire situation. For example, this tweet tweet reading, "My dude, I get that it sucks that you and others didn't get codes, but suggesting that's because you weren't a big..."
I feel like I've never read a tweet that starts with "my dude" that wasn't patronizing and obnoxious. And I feel like that still remains to be the case.
fan of the game is freaking ridiculous, and leaving this post up is just going to give the chuds more brain-dead reasons to attack the game, devs, and fans alike, because
it's crazy to me how people draw these culture war battle lines, and then it makes it impossible for them to see any level of gray area or nuance inside of a conversation. So what did chuds have to do with this? It doesn't have anything to do with the content of the game. It's about making sure everybody can get a review code so the people that want to review the game for their audience can give their audience their fair take on the game. It has nothing to do with like the gender of the people that are doing it. It has nothing to do with like what the content of the game is or what the social media stuff. It has nothing to do with it. It's a completely separate issue.
Apparently analyzing a situation where corporations may be operating in shady manners and analyzing a lot behind such actions.
You're looking at it through the lens of culture war, and that's not, and everything isn't about that. That's not the point.
Their drive to manipulate public sentiment.
This is a meta-level problem inside of journalism, enough to the point to where there's a term for it by Access Journalism. And beyond that, this is an entire, like there was the whole Gamergate thing that happened. That was this was one of the heads of that Hydra. And on top of that, it is a problem with game media too. It's crazy how this is even a conversation.
Well, doing that just makes you a chud. Once again, like I said yesterday, there's this weird crossover with some of the largest bootlickers on the internet, some of the biggest corporate defenders out there, simultaneously LARPing as if they're wonderful activists. Another commonly shared sentiment between Dragon Age fans is that Veilguard just doesn't feel like a Dragon Age game, and people are often wondering, what happened to BioWare? I myself haven't played that many BioWare games. However, one of my favorite PC games of all time, and one that helped inspire my love for PC gaming, is in fact the original Neverwinter Nights. So I found this particular part of Mr. Matty Plays video to be very interesting.
Let's get into it, starting with the narrative. This is what I have the most to say about when it comes to the game itself, because it's where I think most of the problems in Dragon Age the Veilguard.
Is that I thought that was Sonichu. Never mind.
Tonally, this is just not a Dragon Age game. There's no other way to put it for me. In writing, in music, in visuals, in character work, there were many points throughout my review process where I felt my hands were on an entirely different IP. Now, before I go forward, I just want to frame my criticism a little bit more here.
The dude leaked footage and yeah, this guy fucked up with his NDA thing. He did. Yeah, big mistake on his part. Shouldn't have done that.
In that I have been a lifelong BioWare
Mistakes
fan.
happen,
My favorite game of all time is Star Wars Knights of the Republic, which is a 2003 RPG from BioWare. But also, they have made games, as you know, like Mass Effect, like Dragon Age Origins. But I have also not fooled myself that the people who made those games I adore so much are no longer at the company, or at least most of them are.
The ship
this is an unfortunate realization that many of us are having with companies like BioWare, and of course also companies like Bethesda, specifically with BioWare and Veilguard. It seems like they're more intent on pushing out their old fans, and instead trying to find a new group of fans, a more modern group of fans, as these corpos like to say. Ultimately, while many of the reviews coming out today are overly optimistic and positive about the game, there are still some reviews that are much more critical, and as some would say, much more real about their opinions. As mentioned, please consider checking out Mr. Matty Plays video, which I'll link in the description. Another review that seems very interesting, and yet one that I have not had the time to check out yet, is the one released by SkillUp, fittingly titled, "I do not recommend Dragon Age the Veilguard." Based off some of the top comments, though, it seems
every interaction sounds like HR is in the room is probably the most damning critique of this game any reviewer could have said. I feel like that's a lot of cases. Yeah.
like one of the criticisms he might include in his video is one that we've talked about in prior videos on Veilguard, which is seemingly how the devs didn't want the player to be able to make any sort of evil choices, that they'd be too quote-unquote icky, so to speak, which was apparently some of the logic as to why they also removed the options for blood magic. As you know, many people and companies are currently attempting to prop this game up. However, given how terrible the situation looks, it seems highly unlikely.
Why can't you do blood magic? There's people cut themselves all the time.
That they'll succeed in the long run. Ultimately, of course, make up your own opinion on this game, but from what I've seen so far, it's not looking good at all. One of the most disturbing things, as we just talked about a moment ago, is how so many gaming companies like BioWare, etc., have willingly decided to go down this path. Let me know what you think about all this stuff in the comments. As always, thank you so much for tuning in, and if you enjoyed my coverage, please consider liking and or subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you, and I'll see you in the next one.
Hi.
Well, you know what I think? I think I should try it and play it for myself. I think that we should take a look at this game. I'll link you guys the video. Make sure to give it a like. And I think that we should actually give it a shot. I bought the game earlier. And I think that we need to start trying this game and play it ourselves.
Oh, Esmond, you're being way too lenient. But good on you and following your own conclusions.
The Joe Rogan Experience.
Train by day, Joe Rogan podcast by night, all day.
All right, we're rolling. Good to see you, sir. Here we go. One of the things I wanted to talk to you about, I wanted to play this, but we decided we shouldn't play it because it could get copyright strike, and we don't want to get the episode. We don't want anybody to have any sort of a way to get it down.
Sure.
But it was the
in rural Ohio that nobody, except for a few of us, I care about them obviously, but no person in the Harris administration cared about. And so when we went to the White House and just said you could move money, like even just give us a couple $1 million to collect the samples and get the study started, and then we'll privately fund it down the road. We couldn't get anything from them, and I think it was just they were like, we've got bigger fish to fry.
So do you know what efforts have been made to clean that area up, or what?
Oh yeah,
actually
no,
can
I mean,
be
look,
done?
we've definitely.
Does it
we
show
have
what
definitely,
it is, Jamie? So
yeah,
25,800 gallons of TILX, 25,800. What's that?
That's the car.
That's the car
how much
ID.
Gallons was on it.
The capacity and then the contents is
100,000 gallons of that.
Yeah.
Oh, each car has. I
each
see
car
what
had
you're
different
saying.
stuff. Yeah, each car had different stuff.
So what's the total of all of it?
Somewhere like it's 100,000. That's another like
I mean,
300.
it's millions, right?
350,000 gallons or so.
Oh,
or millions of liters. But look, I mean,
and all that stuff just leaks into the groundwater. It goes into
and
the
a lot
soil.
of people. It's a rural area. So a lot of people are in well water. A lot of people are just breathing in the air. I mean,
and we
when
won't even know what the health consequences are for those folks for years.
We won't know, and we may never really know because we didn't collect the samples at the time. Because you got to establish the baseline. That was what my epidemiologist guy that I talked to in North Carolina said. You've got to establish the baseline because here's what's going to happen. Right, fast forward 10 years, people get weird cancers. Sometimes because of chemical spills, sometimes just because that's human biology. Somebody will sue the train company, which is Norfolk, I think Norfolk Southern, will sue the train company, and they'll say, I've got this weird cancer because of you. And what Norfolk Southern will say is, no, you don't. You don't have this weird cancer because of me. You have it because of just, you sort of lost the game of Russian roulette that is human biology. And what we could have said conclusively was yes or no. And unfortunately, we're not going to be able to say that. But this is one of the things, like when we're in office, the first disaster that we have, hopefully there aren't any, but there always are. First chemical disaster that we're going to take the infrastructure of that study and right away, we're going to try to establish a baseline.
Is it possible to, when you have a spill of that magnitude, can you actually get everything out of the ground? Do you have to just remove all the ground? Like, how would you? Well, you'd have to test the groundwater to make sure that it doesn't.
To their credit, and you're not going to hear me praising these guys that much, but the local EPA folks, I actually think, did a pretty good job there on the water side, because what they basically did is they just ran the water in the creeks through, a filtration system, cleaned it, oxidized it, and then got the chemicals out of it and then put it back into the system. Now, the problem is the stuff that's just in the ground, you can't really get that out.
Right.
Right.
You'd have to remove the ground.
You'd have to remove the ground and clean. I don't even know how you would clean it. I don't know if we have the capacity to clean it. What you can do is try to, as we did, we passed out bottled water and tried to make sure that people weren't drinking the water until the levels of toxins hit a certain level. And again, but the issue is never like the levels of toxins are going to kill you. The issue is always, are they going to cause long-term problems? That we got so focused, and I think the media got so focused on, is the water safe to drink? And it's like, the question is not, is the water safe to drink? The question is the water safe to drink for the next 15 years?
Right.
And we're never going to know the answer to that question.
Ugh. Yeah, people are terrified of this idea of someone sabotaging things like that have trains that contain toxic chemicals. People are terrified about the sabotaging of the grid in particular.
Sure.
That's one that a lot of people have talked about
Yeah.
that we're very vulnerable.
Yep.
Like what can be
Big time.
done to sort of shore that up? It seems like cyber attacks are possible, physical attacks are possible.
Yeah.
And if the grid goes down, we have a real problem, right?
We do have a real problem. I mean, look, there's the New York Times or somebody else reported recently that my phone was allegedly hacked by Chinese hackers. And so,
oh, no. What'd they get?
Yeah. I don't think anything.
Nothing? Come on, man. Got anything in there?
We'll find it. We'll find out, man. We'll find out.
Got any memes you probably shouldn't have shared with your friends?
Some offensive memes, and me telling my wife to get an extra gallon of milk at the grocery store. I mean, luckily I'm a pretty boring guy, so I don't think that they got really anything.
That's
but,
nice.
we'll find out.
It's nice to be boring if your phone gets hacked.
Yeah,
like,
that's right. That's right. Well, it also, I mean, it's apparently they couldn't get the encrypted messages that were sent, so I'm pretty careful about like making sure I use Signal and iMessage and all that stuff.
That's
anyway.
great.
So, I mean, look, maybe they got some stuff. We'll find out eventually. I try not to worry too much about shit I can't control. But one thing that came up, by the way, in that, and I'll go back to your question, is about the grid. One thing that came up in that is the way that they hacked, and it was also President Trump's phone apparently too, the way that they hacked our phones is they used the backdoor telecom infrastructure that had been developed in the wake of the Patriot Act. And this is something that I think should be a much bigger part of the controversy over the Patriot Act is when the Patriot Act was passed, like AT&T, Verizon, they had to build all of these systems so that if somebody got a FISA warrant and could hack into a particular phone, the infrastructure actually existed. What I've been told is that infrastructure was used by this Chinese hacker organization called Salt Typhoon, and that's how they got into the Verizon network, and that's how they got into the AT&T network.
What a great name, by the way, Salt Typhoon.
It's a pretty badass name, right? If they have anything on me, I can't be too pissed off at them. At least they named themselves Salt Typhoon. But the answer to the question about the grid is, this is actually, it's one of these things where if we had a functional government, it's pretty easy to develop the systems. Because if you do like an EMP attack, right? Ron Johnson, who's a senator from Wisconsin, is really preoccupied with this. It doesn't take down the whole grid. What it really screws with is the power transformer system. So what we should have is basically a backup power transformer for every major system in the United States of America, just sitting in a warehouse that's turned off. And because it's turned off, it won't be affected by an EMP pulse. And then if there is an EMP attack, you just get those transformers to swap out the ones that were destroyed, and then the grid is back up and running. It's actually a scandal, I think, that the federal government has not just at one point, with all the money that we spend on defense and everything else, just said, we're going to spend $15 billion to buy enough power transformers to have a backup for every transformer in the country. We should do that.
Yeah, one of the things that Trump talked about that a lot of people probably weren't aware of was the damage that these wind turbines are doing to whales. I wasn't totally aware of it. I
had no idea until I watched your podcast with him.
I knew a little bit about it, but I didn't read about it until after I talked to him. And it's a real problem.
It's a very real problem.
And what a conundrum for people that are so-called environmentalists to think the wind is like the cleanest option when it's not. The turbines don't last. You can't recycle them.
It doesn't work in salt water in particular, which is what most of the world's water is. I think wind is the biggest scam out there. It's total bullshit.
It's also pollution. When I see those gigantic wind tunnels,
they're ugly.
They're gross.
They're ugly.
Yeah.
I mean, I thought this, where were me and my wife? We used to be into road trips before we had a Secret Service detail. And we took a road trip, the good old days, man. We took a road trip through Kansas or Nebraska, or maybe it was Iowa. It was one of the, I mean, we went through all three of those states, but I can't remember where. You just go for miles and miles, and you see nothing but wind turbines. And it's like, this is beautiful American countryside that used to be green, rolling hills. And now you have these disgusting dystopian wind turbines. I'm sorry, they are ugly. I will die on this hill. They're ugly. I don't want them in American society.
And nuclear power plants are actually more efficient, safer, and you don't have the problem. Like, we think about the problems of nuclear waste. Like, they've kind of sorted a lot of those out. They haven't sorted out the problems of getting rid of these turbines.
No, they haven't. Not at all.
I have a buddy of mine who lives in South Texas, and I went to visit him, and you drive down there, and it's like an hour of turbines. They're everywhere. There's so many of them.
I can't stand
You just
that.
see them as like the sky is turning dark. You see these things just spinning. It just looks gross.
They kill the birds. They apparently kill
They
the
kill
whale.
a lot
they
of
kill
birds.
a lot of birds.
If you look underneath them, it's like bird graveyards. It's crazy.
It really is.
And it's clean. It's green. It's like we're brainwashed to think that these things somehow or another are beneficial because they're attached to this idea of being environmentally conscious.
Well, and I got the thought behind them, right? I understand why we were trying to turn. That's obviously a source of energy because you have wind blowing through. That's energy that we should capture, but we're just not that good at it with this,
it's
right?
not
Maybe
very
there's
efficient.
right. Just accept that it was a mistake. It's not that efficient. The political or the environmental costs are pretty significant. Solar I think is actually a little bit more reasonable because you can get a lot more of the power. They last a little bit longer. They're not nearly as ugly, and you can put them in places where people don't frankly want to live that much anyway, like in deserts and things like that.
Well, they do those roofs now. Like Tesla does a solar roof,
yeah,
which
the
is
solar roofs
fantastic.
I think that's a great way, right? That's just empty space. But wind, I think we just should say this was a failed experiment. We're going to stop subsidizing this, and if people want to have a wind turbine, great, but we're not going to build miles and miles of wind turbines anymore, at least not with taxpayer subsidy.
But I just hope people recognize that the trade-off is not worth it. Like, you're getting a little bit of electricity. You're really ruining the landscape. You're ruining the view. You're killing birds. You're messing up whales. And those things don't last that long. And then when you got to get rid of them, you got to put them in a landfill. Like, the whole thing's bananas.
It's totally bananas. And again, we focus on the carbon footprint thing, and we don't talk about the fact that there are these massive environmental hazards. It goes back to the distracted politics versus the real stuff, and we should be talking about the real environmental consequences of wind power.
It's one of those things that, again, is much like a religion where you must stay with the doctrine. You must follow it by the word. Because if you step out of line and say, actually, when you look at these studies, it doesn't really show that the world is warming. It shows that over the last X amount of thousands of years, we're in a gradual cooling period, and that what's really terrifying is global cooling.
Yes.
Randall Carlson, who's an expert in asteroid collisions and the Younger Dryas impact theory, is a fascinating guy. But he says that the periods in history where we came very close to extinction are like when there's an ice age.
Yes.
Like, those are the most terrifying.
That's right.
When there's global warming, you just move to where it's not so warm, and that's what people have done forever.
Well, and you deal with it technologically, right? This is the thing, that the solution to global warming, for however long this warming trend lasts, is to deal with it technologically, right? I mean, if you look at the number of people who die from disasters in the United States, it's going down because we've gotten better at predicting stuff and helping people deal with things. And of course, you still have terrible things like Hurricane Helene, but they are luckily part of a downward trend in people losing their lives from terrible storms. And, if you really think that carbon, this is another reason why I'm somewhat skeptical of like the carbon obsessives, is if you think that carbon is the most significant thing, the sole focus of American civilization should be to reduce the carbon footprint of the world, then you would be investing in nuclear in a big way. And then when you say that, the environmentalists say, well, you've got all these poison rocks to deal with afterwards. Well, the poison rocks problem is a less significant problem than the carbon problem if you think that we're all going to go extinct in 100 years. So let's deal with the most pressing problem. They're all like, no. And their solution is to buy solar panels that are disproportionately made in China, which has the worst carbon footprint and growing of any country in the entire world. They obviously don't believe their own bullshit, which is why I'm somewhat skeptical of what they say.
Also, when you have a movement and your spokesperson is Greta Thunberg and not some insanely intelligent scientist who's done years of research on this stuff, and there's also not a consensus among scientists. There's a lot of scientists that are heretics, that are stepping outside the lines. that are saying that this is not an issue. And then they're also pointing out the fact that carbon is what trees consume, and there's more greenery in the world today than there was 100 years ago, which is a very inconvenient thing for people.
See, I didn't even realize that.
Yeah.
I had no idea. That's
well,
true.
Carbon is what trees feed off of.
So I knew carbon is what trees feed off of. I didn't know there was more greenery than there was 100 years ago. That's interesting.
Not only that, you got Bill Gates that's saying planting trees is not a solution to the carbon problem. Like,
wait a second.
This is so not true.
What seems so crazy.
It's so not true, and it's also historically, like, one of the craziest moments in history, in my opinion, is the Mongols and what the Mongols did in the 1200s. They lowered the carbon footprint of Earth because they killed so many people. They killed 10% of the population of Earth.
That is crazy.
And because of that, because they devastated these places and killed so many people, trees grew. More trees grew. And it lowered the carbon footprint.
Wow.
These places that had been overcome by agriculture were then reconsumed by nature.
Yeah.
And it lowered the carbon footprint of Earth.
Well, there is a fundamentally, it raises the point, there's a fundamentally anti-human element of the radical environmental movement in the United States of America.
They're saying we have to reduce population. This is one. And when they say it with vaccines, you're like, slow down.
That's right.
Did you just say that out loud?
Shit, yes.
And then if you read Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and I encourage everyone to read Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s book, The Real Anthony Fauci, because it's not just about this crisis that we went through with COVID-19. It's about a host of different things that were done. And one of them was a vaccine that was supposed to be a DPT vaccine that they were giving to girls in Africa that was just birth control.
Wow.
It was just sterilizing them.
Wow.
And that they were,
I didn't even realize
they were giving them HCG, and that they were giving them into this enhanced schedule. I don't want to screw this up because my recall is not the best. I don't want to, but the reality is there was experiments done on unwitting, unknowing African women where they gave them this thing that was supposed to be a vaccine against a disease, but it was really sterilizing them. And they were experimenting.
That's dark. Again, that's like the Native American OxyContin thing.
But that's this
dark
global health
Yeah.
shit.
Yeah.
Like, there's a lot of experimenting going on.
That's right.
That's what's we pulled up an AP article. I had Alex Jones tell me this. I was like, "What?" It's like they gave him polio. They tried the vaccine. They gave him polio. I'm like, what?
That's
so
a
then
good
we pulled
Alex
up
Jones impersonation.
It's an AP article that shows that they had to stop giving these kids in Africa this polio vaccine because it was actually giving them polio.
That's crazy.
Like, because they experiment, because this is how they find out if stuff works. So you get people with no internet connection, they live in dirt floors. We're going to help you. And then they come in and they experiment on them. And it's so dark.
That is so dark,
And then it's all done through this idea of philanthropy.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's crazy, and they profit off of it. The whole thing is madness. And because they have so much influence and so much power and so much money is being generated, they're allowed to get away with these things.
Just think about that from the perspective of these poor people. I mean, I assume the polio vaccine thing happened in Africa, or did it happen somewhere else? Okay, so you're in Africa. Some white dude shows up, says that he cares about you, gives you a shot that's going to, prevent you from getting some disease, and then you become like permanently disabled, or you even die because of it. Like, think about what effect that has on how those Africans perceive our civilization. And are we going to have, are they going to we're going to have a conflict in 30, 40 years because people are so pissed off about us coming in and giving them health care that isn't actually health care. I really worry about that stuff. I mean, this is one of my big things with the Russia-Ukraine conflict is people don't realize how much of Africa's food supply comes from the Ukraine, like an astonishing amount. So if you have this war that goes, we're going to have a conflict in 30, 40 years because people are so pissed off about us coming in and giving them health care that isn't actually health care. I really worry about that stuff. I mean, this is one of my big things with the Russia-Ukraine conflict is people don't realize how much of Africa's food supply comes from the Ukraine, like an astonishing amount. So if you have this war that goes on forever and there's not enough food going to Africa, are you going to have a bunch of starving, desperate people who are like pissed off because they're starving, who hate European civilization because they don't have, they're not getting the food that they were expecting to get? Like, we never think about the knock-on effects of this stuff, right? You're like, yeah, it's really dark and really evil that we're giving them polio. I also wonder, the people who live in the village that got polio, what the hell are they going to be doing in 30 years? They're probably going to hate us.
Yeah, I would be really upset if you gave my kid polio.
Yeah.
You came over here.
Yeah,
like,
justifiably so.
Some
Justifiably
mission.
so, I'd hate these people, right? You give my kid polio under the pretense of helping them? It's crazy.
But then there's also pharmaceutical drugs that are really beneficial. And this is the thing, like they have to have guardrails. You have to have some rules and regulations to keep these people from just never-ending profits.
Yes.
Because they always gravitate towards that. They always gravitate towards making the most amount of money.
And again, this is where I go back to some of the arguments of the old left. Like, what kind of guardrails do you want these companies to have? Do you want the guardrails to be that if you donate to the trans, pride, and BLM organizations, you get to do whatever the hell you want?
Right.
Or do you want the guardrails like, we're going to protect health and public safety and make sure that you're not, like, killing people under the auspice of helping them?
Yeah. And
that's the kind of guardrails I want. The common
very
sense
logical. Yeah, very logical. But logic is, dangerous today. Like logic.
Oh man,
logic is it's a problem when you have ideologies and people strictly adhere.
Logic is a colonial idea, man. You got to get away from the logic.
And
that's
math is racist.
That's
I don't know
right.
if you know about that. That's a new one.
Well, okay, so this is interesting. There's this movie that's probably like extremely influential to my entire political worldview, and I didn't realize until last night because I got into Austin late. Usually my wife travels with me. She wasn't with me last night. She's taking care of the kids today. So I get into the hotel room in Austin, and it's very late, and I watch this movie, Boys in the Hood. Have you ever seen Boys in the Hood?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay. I watched that movie a ton when I was like 8, 9 years old, and I didn't realize how much that movie has had an influence on me until I watched it last night. Okay, so, all right, for Furious Styles, a lot of his stuff about not letting financial institutions buy up all the stuff in your communities. Obviously, he's talking about black people in LA and not, white people in, rural small town America. But I was like, oh, like that's maybe the first place that I ever heard this idea. Or he talks about like the importance of fatherhood, the importance of especially young boys having a father in the home. It's like I got that from Boys in the Hood, and obviously it spoke to me when I was a kid because I grew up at the time and I didn't have much of a relationship with my dad. And it's interesting, man. He makes this observation, math being racist. He's criticizing the SAT for being culturally biased, but then he says the only part that isn't culturally biased is the math. And it's like, oh, this is like a black nationalist in the mid 80s, because that's kind of the philosophy of this movie, is what you might call like old school black leftism. This movie in the 1980s is saying something that I wish a lot of white liberals would hear today, which is actually math is not racist. It's one, it's one of the things that's like not definitively not racist is math and numbers. You guys are losing your damn minds.
Well, math is racist is one of those ones where it's like if you heard that in a cocktail party, you'd be like, what? Like if someone behind you was saying math is racist, you'd be like, what the? We got to get out of here, honey. Grab your purse.
I'd say I want to go. I want one of what they're having. I want to hang out with those guys. Okay. By the way, this is an act of bipartisanship. The one thing that Republicans, man, that I think we got really wrong in the last few years is the anti-Hunter Biden stuff. I want to go hang out with Hunter Biden. I mean, I may be the only Republican. That dude.
He was like Hunter S. Thompson without the writing talent. That guy went hard. You got to give it to him.
I would bet $100 that Hunter Biden is voting for Donald Trump for president.
It doesn't seem like he likes his dad. It seems like
his dad. I might bet $20 on his dad voting for Donald Trump for president, especially last night after the garbage comment.
Oh yeah.
That guy is trying to help Donald Trump. We're going to win. I think we're going to win. But after we win, I'm going to be convinced that Joe Biden was trying to help us the whole time.
Well, here's
he put on a MAGA hat.
The MAGA hat was crazy.
That was crazy.
When he put on the MAGA hat in front of those guys and they all cheered, and he insisted on keeping the hat and he took it with him, I think he's very, very resentful that he got ousted in what was essentially a coup.
Yeah.
And
I'd love to know what happened there, by the way.
I would love to know what happened. I have to use the restroom, but when we come back, let's talk about that because this is important. I just have to pee. We'll be right back. So the wildest thing about the laptop was that they were able to suppress it from social media. And
really wild.
When I discussed that with Zuckerberg, and he openly admitted it, that the FBI had contacted him and told him that it was Russian disinformation. Correct. And that was one of those things where he was saying, I was like, this guy's just saying this?
Yeah.
And
I remember when that episode came out because it reverberated across American politics like crazy. Like, holy shit, he just said the thing that we all suspected for a very long time.
And if it wasn't for Elon purchasing Twitter and then finding out how much of an influence they were having on this, and that they were, in fact, silencing something that they knew to be correct under a lie. Yes. Under a lie, and 51 former intelligence agents signed off on this.
That's right.
It was like, how did they pull that off? Like, pulling that off is really wild. And the fact that there was no outrage from the left that the left was like, it's fine because it's our side and Trump is evil and he's Hitler. We got to get rid of him. So let's just lie about this laptop.
And no consequences.
Nothing.
Right?
The same people that pushed it are still...
And by the way, they still all have security clearances, I believe, which is going to change when we win. But, I mean, also, this is where I always get pissed about the media conversation around what happened in 2020 is what they'll do is they'll sort of find the craziest conspiracy theory about what happened in 2020. They'll debunk it and say, "Oh, look, this shows that nothing bad happened in 2020." There's a nonpartisan organization that actually looked at what would have happened to Americans' votes if they had just known the truth about the fact that Joe Biden fundamentally had traded his political influence for money. Like, that's what it was. It's an old-fashioned American corruption story. I will give you access to powerful people in exchange for money, right? That was the true scandal of the Hunter Biden laptop. Again, it wasn't Hunter Biden doing cocaine with a stripper.
That was the fun part.
You can say that. I have an election to win. So that was the real scandal.
The corruption.
It was the corruption. And this
evidence of the corruption.
And direct evidence of the corruption. And the nonpartisan organization said that knowledge, which was suppressed by the entire American media and big tech scene, that would have changed millions upon millions of votes. And we know that the number in 4 swing states was 88,000 votes that were the difference between Donald Trump and Joe Biden winning the 2020 election. So set to the side all of the other arguments about fraud and all the other rule changes that happened in the midst of COVID. We know that big tech colluded with our own sort of, I would say colluded. The one thing I'll say about Zuckerberg is, and I don't know him super well. I've never had a problem with him, but I do wonder if it's a convenient excuse. I don't doubt that the FBI said, hey, this is Russian disinformation, but these companies still have to take some agency over this too, right? So I think it was both the corruption of the FBI and the intelligence services, but also the big technology companies themselves. Both of them are at blame. And I think fundamentally, if they had not done what they did, Donald Trump would have won another term as president of the United States. You're never going to be able to convince me that if millions upon millions of swing voters knew the evidence of Joe Biden's corruption and it was staring them in the face, that we would not have been able to pull that one out.
Well, Zuckerberg has gotten really into mixed martial arts. He's gotten really into jiu-jitsu and really into training. And there's very few things that will turn you into a conservative more than martial arts training. Like there's no way to get ahead other than hard work.
Well, have you seen all these studies that basically connect testosterone levels in young men with conservative politics?
Oh, yeah.
So maybe that's what's going on.
Well, there's a certain amount
maybe that's why the Democrats want us all to be, poor health and overweight, is because that means we're going to be, it means we're going to be more liberal, right? If you make people less healthy, they apparently become more politically liberal. That's an interesting observation.
Well, I think there's like socially liberal, like live and let live, do whatever you want as long as you're not hurting anybody, which is really what I am. And then the reality
these labels get all confused, right? Yeah.
And this is where it gets sort of conflated, like the reality of hard work being a virtue.
Yes.
And this has always been a conservative idea, is that you're really supposed to like make your mark in this world and get up in the morning and work hard, and you should be proud of that.
Yes.
The only way to get good at jiu-jitsu is hard work.
Yes.
So everybody who really trains hard and gets good has a certain level of just a true understanding of the real relationship, that the actual, the mathematical equation of focus, time, energy, and discipline versus positive results.
Yep.
And there's only one way to excel. There's no other way to excel at martial arts other than training hard. So it's kind of normal that he's becoming like leaning more libertarian and wearing hoodies now.
Yeah. No, my secret
jacked.
My secret theory is that Zuck is now a Trump supporter, but he can't say that publicly, of course. But hopefully he is.
Really difficult to say that now. That's why guys like Bill Ackman and Chamath and all these people that stand out.
It's taken real courage. It really has. Yeah, and I like both of those guys
because they really do get excommunicated.
Absolutely. They do.
Cocktail parties are a mess after that in Marin County. They think you're a Nazi.
And that's putting it mildly. But yeah, I mean, one of my closest friends in the tech world is David Sachs. And Dave and I have talked about this because we were both it's funny, we were both sort of critical of Trump in 2016, but we came, at that criticism from a right to center perspective. And both of us by 2020 were like, this crazy bullshit has to end. Trump is our guy. And maybe not only is he our guy, but maybe he was like the only one who could have turned the tide against this insanity. And David, I mean, he has become so far out there, and I admire it in a lot of ways. And then sometimes I see what David says, and I'm like, dude, are you going to be like welcome in,
like, what is he saying?
In your neighborhood? Well, I mean, have you ever interviewed David Sachs?
No.
Well, I mean, he's just, look, he's very anti-woke. He's very, very into what I would call foreign policy realism. Like, why are we starting these stupid wars all over the world? Our foreign policy should be more pro-peace. And it's just crazy to me because he's so inflammatory about it that and by the way, I love it. Right. I agree with what a lot of what David says. And even when I disagree, I know he's a smart guy. But he is just saying, look, I don't give a shit. If you're going to come after me, but I'm going to say what's on my mind. And I think, a lot of people are going in that direction, which is fundamentally a good thing, is people are sick of being told what to think. And like the First Amendment, obviously, it's a legal document that talks about the role of government in censorship and sort of prohibits government censorship. But it's also a sort of ethic and an attitude that is endemic, or I hope is, to American society, which is we're going to think what we want, we're going to say what we want to. That's an important First Amendment value, even though it has nothing to do with the First Amendment as a legal document itself. And a lot of people are sick of being told what to think.
I was very upset when Tim Walsh was saying that the First Amendment doesn't apply to hate speech and misinformation.
Totally nuts.
Like, especially those two terms, hate speech and misinformation, because hate speech...
They're in the eye of the beholder.
Right. It's so subjective, and it's the marks are moving as to what's called hate speech now. It's moving further and further away from normalcy.
If you say that an 11-year-old should not get gender transition drugs, that is hate speech according to a significant subset of the left.
Yeah, if you call Caitlyn Jenner Bruce Jenner, that's hate speech.
A lot of people would say that's hate speech.
And you used to get banned for life from Twitter for dead naming someone.
Yes.
Which is just bananas.
Which is totally bananas.
You can call him a cunt, but you can't call him Bruce. The whole thing is so crazy.
Yeah.
It's just
I think that this is, and look, I try not to be too partisan because I know a lot of people watch your show, but this is to me the biggest and most fundamental difference between Kamala and President Trump in the campaign is, whether it's Biden calling people garbage or Tim Walz calling people fascist and Kamala calling people Nazis, or endorsing explicit censorship, we're not trying to censor our fellow Americans, right? We'll attack Kamala and her policies and her ideas, but we're not trying to say you should be silenced because you disagree with us. That is anathema to everything that I believe in. And that is what's happened in the modern Democratic Party, at least at the leadership level, is they've gotten really comfortable with the idea of silencing people who disagree with them, such to the point where, it's not even that Tim Walz thinks that hate speech should be censored. It's that the governor of a state could utter that phrase without recognizing how fundamentally subjective it is. Right? Or Hillary Clinton saying that we want to censor misinformation. She has come out and explicitly said that we have to censor disinformation and misinformation.
Or we lose total control. Like, hey, you're not supposed to have total control
exactly.
over discourse.
That's the whole point.
Yes.
We don't want people to have total control. And they can utter it without the American media going completely bananas. Just suggests there's something broken about the political culture of the left. I mean, there are people on CNN and CBS and all these other sort of mainstream networks, I would call them corporate networks, all these corporate networks that will say, when Donald J. Trump says that if you riot after the election, you're the enemy of the people or you're an enemy within, like that is a major threat to democracy. But Hillary Clinton saying that we should censor disinformation, they're just, no big deal. And the fact that they can get so fired up about what I think is a pretty common sense observation that if you riot, law enforcement should have a response to it, but they think that it's the end of they don't care at all. Don't care at all when Hillary Clinton and Tim Walz endorse explicit censorship. That should scare the hell out of us.
It should scare the hell out of you whenever any politician is encouraging censorship.
Yes.
Especially when it's about things, like we said, about hate speech and misinformation. Like, misinformation according to who? Because we've already shown that there's a bunch of different factors that have control over what is presented as fact.
Yes.
And they're not always honest or accurate. And these things get put out, and it harms people, and then there's some sort of a correction that comes along. Well, the only way to find that out, especially like during the COVID times, these things that they called misinformation, how many of them turned out to be true? Almost all of them.
It's crazy.
The Wuhan lab, it was racist to assume that when Jon Stewart did that bit on Colbert, did you see that?
I have never seen it, no.
It's amazing, because you see Colbert scrambling, and he's trying to, John's like, do you think maybe the lab that was the Wuhan coronavirus lab Like maybe it came from there. Like,
well, it was so obvious. I mean, the whole argument for the start of COVID that wasn't from the Wuhan lab was basically, as I understood it, that a bat had gotten a weird coronavirus and had like fallen into a guy's soup at a wet,
or
at a wet market.
Pangolin was involved.
Yeah.
There's so much stupidity
and
involved
that's
in it.
like, that was more believable than there's the Wuhan coronavirus lab. And yeah, I remember when Tom Cotton was the first major American politician to talk about this. Tom's like a good friend, and he was immediately pilloried as this terrible racist. And it's bizarre that we're not allowed to talk about things in the United States of America. I will say, I think it's gotten better. This is one of my more optimistic views is, when we're all locked in our houses in the summer of 2020, I think that did weird things psychologically to everybody.
Agree.
And I think that a lot of people rebelled against it, and we're probably in a better position now in 2024. Like Chamath would not have come out. I love Chamath. Would not have come out for Donald Trump in 2020. Right. Now he's hosting fundraisers and giving hundreds of thousands of dollars to our campaign. So I think the fact that you have so many old school liberals and old school leftists say, we're done with this bullshit, is actually a pretty good sign. Yeah, there's still social consequences to it, but not nearly as high as they were 4 years ago.
Well, I think when Elon purchased Twitter, it changed the entire game. Because now you have this Wild West, uncensored version of social media that's run by this super genius madman who has all the money in the world.
That's right.
It's so crazy. I mean, it's really, without him, we're in a lot of trouble. Because let's say Twitter never gets purchased. They run the same way they've run it in the past, where they're being influenced by whatever companies and whatever agencies decide to remove posts or remove people and ban Donald Trump and ban a bunch of different conservatives and ban a bunch of people that were outcasts, and they just decided they were controlling the discourse. Well, then you have no outlets other than Parler, and we discussed this yesterday. Those outlets 100% got infested by bots, where they're putting Nazi stuff up and like, oh, this is a Nazi site. Like, no, you're the Nazi. You put it up there.
Yeah, exactly.
You poisoned it.
Exactly.
Instead of it being just a place where conservatives can go and talk about things and not be censored like they were on Twitter, then they get infiltrated with all this hate shit, and then it becomes a hateful place, and they don't even want to go, so now they're homeless.
That's right.
Well, now all of a sudden Twitter comes along, Elon comes along, has this complete shift in how he's viewing this attack on free speech. Then you have Schellenberger and Matt Taibbi. They go into the Twitter files, and they find like, oh my God, like this is unconstitutional.
This was industrial scale censorship is what it was.
And they weren't right. They did all this stuff, and it turned out that all the things they were saying were either lies or were incorrect.
Correct.
And there's no repercussions. And so you're seeing all this in real time, and no one on the left has any problem with it, which to me is insanity. And the people that do have a problem with it, their solution seems to be to just go to the right. They don't even feel like you can reform the left. People are just like Tulsi Gabbard becomes a Republican. People are just abandoning this. Like, I can't talk to you people.
That's right. I'm doing an event with Tulsi Gabbard tonight in Pennsylvania.
I love her.
She's awesome. And I think she basically decided the left cannot be reformed in this country anymore. That's what happened with Bobby Kennedy. That's what's happened with a lot of old school liberals is they say, we don't care what you do in your bedroom, but we believe in the fundamental right of people to speak their mind, and the Democrats just don't believe in that anymore.
So
and
crazy.
I've thought a lot about like what is going on there and what's driving it psychologically. And I think what's going on is the entire modern Democratic Party grew up in an era where there was consensus, right? Walter Cronkite could say something about the Vietnam War, and it turned out he's probably right about that, actually, and it collapsed public support for the Vietnam War. Or they grew up in America where social trust was just so much higher, and I think that a lot of them are trying to reimpose that social trust from the top, not recognizing that high level of social trust came organically from the way that American society worked. And if you have people trying to reimpose it from the top, it actually degrades the very thing that you're trying to create. Because I've seen, family members of mine who got really radicalized because they were like, wait a second, should we be masking 3-year-olds in our schools? Like, does that do something to their language development? And then they would get kicked off of Facebook because a person with 900 Facebook friends who has no public profile dared to like question the prevailing narrative. And again, they ended up being right about it. I actually think that what the left is doing is degrading social trust by trying to create it from on high. And I kind of get the psychological impulse because, like a lot of great things that we do come from high levels of social trust, but you've got to reestablish it organically. You can't try to force it on people.
And there's been some course correcting. Like, did you read Bezos's article? Was it yesterday that came out in the Washington Post?
I did see
that. What
did
you think of that?
I go back and forth. Like, again, I don't know Jeff super well. I've always liked him in my interactions with him. But the problem with the Washington Post is not that their editorial page has been insufficient sufficiently conservative. It's that their entire journalism department is fundamentally engaged in democratic political activism. I mean, the two, we talk about this a lot, and, my political guys are, a lot of them are outside, and certainly a lot of them will watch, but we talk a lot about which of the newspapers that have really gone crazy. And the New York Times is kind of an exception. Yeah, it's very left-wing, but it hasn't totally gone insane. The Washington Post might as well be a propaganda outlet of the Democratic Party. If you look from the Hunter Biden laptop to any number of stories where they just toe the left-wing line almost instinctively. The problem was with the journalism at the Washington Post. It's not with the editorials. I don't care, frankly, whether the editorial page endorses Donald Trump or Kamala Harris. I care about whether the journalists are lying about Donald Trump or lying about Kamala Harris. And frankly, they're lying a lot in the negative direction about my running mate, and they're lying a lot in the positive direction about Kamala Harris. So what I would like to see from Jeff Bezos is a commitment to the Washington Post not just being a Democrat super PAC. I don't give a shit if he hires a few more conservative columnists. It doesn't matter. What matters is, do they hold their journalism to anything like a high standard? And if they don't do that, then to me, it's just window dressing.
But it seems like that's at least a step in the right direction.
Fair.
Like
fair.
One thing would be great.
Fair.
You have an argument against Donald Trump on the front page next to an argument for Donald Trump, and let two different intelligent people state their cases, one from a conservative perspective, one from a liberal perspective, and let's see what resonates with you.
It's a step in the right direction. I just think that unless you change the underlying journalism to make it more fair, it's going to be only a step in the right direction rather than fixing the problem.
Well, what else can he do? I mean, he's probably pretty busy on his yacht, hanging out with his girlfriend with his tight shirts on. How does he have the time? He can't go into the office and read everybody's work.
Okay, so let me give you an example. There's a journalist by the name of Matt Boyle who writes at Breitbart. Do you know Matt Boyle?
Yeah,
Have you
I
ever heard of Matt? Okay, so Matt is, even though he writes for Breitbart, and I know that most people assume that Breitbart is just this right-wing rag, Matt he has one of the best contacts of journalists in Washington. He knows what's going to happen in the country before most left-wing journalists, because he talks to the liberals, he talks to the conservatives, he has allies on Capitol Hill. I'd love to see the Washington Post hire a guy like Matt Boyle and say, Matt, go and do what you're going to do. And obviously, it's not going to be able to have a political bias to it, but go and investigate. If you want to go and investigate Kamala Harris's campaign, go and do it. But that is what it would look like, is empowering conservative and independent journalism in the same way that Jeff Bezos has empowered left-wing journalism. If I see that happening, then I'll I'll be a little bit more optimistic about his stewardship.
Well, could you imagine if there's the same sort of scrutiny on Kamala's speeches and appearances in these media outlets as there is on Trump's?
Oh my God.
Like, one of the things that we talked about was how they edited that one answer that she was asked, like, what, about foreign
At
policy.
CBS.
Yeah. They edited it completely. And I wasn't aware that they put an answer for a completely different question there.
Well, okay, so I think that what happened there, having done try to understand that a little bit better, is they basically just edited her answer down a lot so that she didn't sound like a total insane person. Because what aired, I think, on the smaller, what aired on the channels online that had a smaller pickup
was the rambling.
The
word salad.
But what actually aired on the news programs was, I mean, it still didn't sound very good, but it sounded a hell of a lot better. But let me give you a very good example of this.
It's really not the answer.
So
it's like they changed the answer.
Let me see what. Yeah, no, you're right. They changed the answer, but I just want to find the statistic from my team because I asked them this last night. So they did change the answer, and they changed it in a way to protect her.
Yes.
And then, importantly, they refused to release the transcript, right? So my attitude would be just release the transcript, let people see what she actually said,
right,
so that you at least have some integrity as a journalistic outlet. But okay, so here's, you, of course, I'm sure, paid attention to the kerfuffle over a comedian at the Trump rally at MSG. I think you even know this guy, right?
He's a good friend of mine,
okay, yeah.
Tony Hinchcliffe.
So he tells a joke about, Puerto Rico. The number of mentions on CNN about this joke in the last 48 hours, this was as of last night, 143, on MSNBC 101, on ABC 53, on NBC 32, and on CBS 31. In 2 days, they talked about that joke effectively nonstop. You know what it means to have 31 mentions on NBC News about this particular thing? That is that is saturation. Last night, Joe Biden called the half of America that's going to vote for Donald Trump garbage. Do you think that the word garbage is going to appear on CNN 141 times over the next 2 days?
No.
I would bet no. Now, what's the difference? Well, one difference is that it was a comedian telling a joke, and it's the president of the United States telling what he actually thinks. Another difference is, again, it's a comedian with, at best, a tenuous connection to the Trump campaign. And on the other hand, you have the actual sitting president at a vice presidential campaign event telling the vice president, telling the entire country at an event sanctioned by the Kamala Harris campaign that half of Americans are garbage. And I guarantee the media is not going to cover this in the same way. I mean, here, let me, I don't know if Jamie can bring this up, but I tweeted about this last night, that Politico, when they initially tried to write the story about what had been said by Joe Biden, they said that Biden had called racism against Puerto Ricans garbage. Well, who disagrees with that? I think that racism against Puerto Ricans is garbage, but that's not what he said. He said that Trump supporters are garbage. He said it's on video. So Politico tried to retcon this. It turned out there was a video, so we could actually see for ourselves what was actually said. But the amount of dishonesty in the American media really is off the charts.
It is, but also with Joe Biden, I think at this point in time, he's literally that crazy guy on the porch yelling at the neighbors. I mean, no one thinks he's there, which is also one of the fascinating things when they asked her, when did you know that he was mentally impaired and why didn't you talk about it earlier? And there's this, Joe Biden has always done the amazing work that Joe Biden does. And it's just like this long, where are you going? Yeah. You want to get the lights that they use in the air traffic controller, come this way.
Yeah, come this way.
Help her out. Do you think she wears an earpiece?
I wouldn't be surprised. I have no idea.
The earpiece one was amazing.
But man,
the
she just
Bluetooth thing, the earring.
It's astonishing. She talks. The only way I can describe it is she talks in circles.
Yeah.
Right. It's like
Tim Dillon says it's like she does gypsy curses because she speaks in gypsy curses.
That's very good. But it's we need to build an opportunity economy because if Americans don't have opportunity, then they're not going to have the opportunity to be Americans. And it's like, what the hell?
The opportunity to generate wealth and generational wealth. Like, wait a minute. Do you know how few people generate generational wealth? That means you have so much money, you're going to give it to other generations.
Well, but there's actually, okay, I mean, I give a lot of speeches, so there's actually a skill to this. I think that she is the Michael Jordan of using as many words as possible to say as little as possible. There's actually a certain gift that she has because you listen to her talk and you're 100, 200 words into it, you're 500 words into it, and you're like, what the hell did she just say? She didn't say anything.
Right.
And that actually, I mean, okay, so yeah, there's a certain political skill in saying a lot without actually saying anything, but it actually worries me about her being president. Like, okay, there are all these substantive policy disagreements, and we could talk about, okay, I don't like her border policies, I don't like this, I don't like that. But what does she do when she's in a meeting with a world leader and she has to like know the details of public policy to negotiate with Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping? Like, one of the major things that you do as a president is you participate in economic negotiations. Like, what tariffs are we going to apply on your goods unless you lower the tariffs on ours, or vice versa, right? You have to be able to know a little bit about your job to be the president of the United States. And I don't know that she has an ounce of curiosity about public policy in this country. That's what scares the hell out of me.
Well, it's just strange that everyone's accepting that this person who was the least popular vice president ever is now the solution to the problem, and that the media machine in just a few days did this 180 and just sold her as the solution. And as long as they keep her from having these conversations where she's allowed to talk,
that's right,
they're able to pull this off. And the fact that it's happening with no primary should be really concerning to people, because that's never happened before. They could have had a primary.
Well, it's also part of the process where you identify people's flaws, you figure out what they're good at, what they're bad at. Like, the primary is actually a grueling process.
How you handle pressure.
Right? And we don't really know how she's handled pressure because she's only done it for a little while. And if you just look at Donald Trump's public schedule, J.D. Vance's public schedule versus Kamala Harris, dude, it is striking how little she does. There was an interview that she did. I think it's the only really tough interview she's done with Brett Baier of Fox News. I believe that she had a clear calendar for 2 days before she did this interview.
So they're just prepping her?
Just prepping her. But, how can you actually, that's not pressure. If you could just take 2 days off for one single interview, that's not pressure. And also just little things. I mean, look, there's this story out there. To be clear, I have no idea if it's true, but there's a woman who has gone on the record and said that Doug Emhoff, Kamala Harris's husband, smacked her in the face in France. Okay, that's been reported on the media. I'm sure you guys can find it if you want to. Okay. Again, maybe it's not true, maybe it is true, but these things take time to actually figure out and investigate. And here's the thing. You know this, I know this, most people know this. If you are a domestic abuser, that usually doesn't stop with one person. Like, most domestic abusers are serial domestic abusers. Is it in the public interest to do some investigation about whether the White House, the president, could be sharing the White House with the person who is engaged in domestic abuse? That is in the public interest to know. Not only is the American media not that interested in it, but most importantly, you don't have the time to really investigate some of these accusations. Meanwhile, every time somebody says anything about Donald Trump without an ounce of evidence, the American media picks it up and runs with it and makes an entire news cycle, totally incurious about what's going on with Kamala Harris.
But I think over time, what's interesting is most people are becoming aware of this extreme bias, the difference in the scrutiny that's applied to Trump.
So that's right. But you go back into this question you asked me about Jeff Bezos. This is why you need good reporters who have the investigatory skills, who are empowered by their employers to go out and do the investigations. Like, your platform, you're having more honest and open conversations than anything that's happening in the corporate media. It's like one of the reasons why I listen to your show, one of the reasons why I'm happy to be here. But you don't have like a person working for you who's going to go to like France and talk to this woman and investigate whether this is true. This is why, I've told Elon this, but like the most useful piece of philanthropy, if you're a right of center American, would be to set up a nonprofit organization where you pay a really good reporter for 5 years, you give them complete job security, and you just tell them, go off and investigate what's going on in the world and bring it back and report on the truth. Because if you don't have that, then that is where the media still has a fundamental advantage over us, is they've got an army of people investigating me and Donald Trump. There's no one really investigating Kamala Harris.
Well, there's also the amount of left-wing media versus right-wing media is pretty disturbing.
Yeah.
Like, what is the percentage of networks that lean left? CNN, clearly, MSNBC, ABC, NBC, CBS, and then you have Fox.
And then you have
a couple of online things like News Nation, what have you. But
and if you just
the reach is much less.
It reaches much less. And if you just look at, you're only, you and a few others are the only people who can compare with the actual platform size of an NBC, a CBS. Fewer people watch them now than they did 20 years ago. But if you look, man, like you're still getting 5 to 8 million viewers every single night for each of the major networks on the nightly news. That's incredible reach, right?
Yeah.
There's still a lot of power there. And, to your point about like the comparison, Fox News, number one, if you look at Fox News' viewership compared to NBC's, it just NBC dwarfs it. But more importantly, in some ways, is Fox News, which I do think is very important. But yeah, they have a right of center bias, certainly. I will admit that. But if you look at how much Fox News is covering the left fairly versus the right, it's much more balanced than like an NBC, right? Like NBC would never have an interview with Donald J. Trump where the journalist is asking tough questions, but is like sitting down and broadcasting Donald Trump for an hour. Fox News would do that for Kamala Harris, and they did do that for Kamala Harris, and there's a real difference there.
Well, there's also like the way Brett Breyer interviewed Bear. How do you say
Bear.
Bear.
Yeah.
The way he interviewed Kamala Harris is very similar to the way he interviewed Donald Trump.
Exactly. Exactly.
And nobody accused him of doing anything sneaky then.
No.
Or no one was even angry at him then.
Well, because the expectation is that you're going to interrupt and you're going to fact check and you're going to try to actually do the job of an interviewer. But the expectation is that if you touch Kamala with anything other than kid gloves, you're not allowed to do that.
But I think most people are upset. It's one of the reasons why the movement is so, the movement towards Trump, they're so enthusiastic. They're so energetic.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's because they do realize that there's this imbalance and they don't like it. And they think that the only way this is going to get fixed is someone who's a complete outsider. And you can't be more outsider than a guy who they're literally turning the judicial system against him. They're literally trying to prosecute him like a banana republic. And they're doing it over and over and over again. And they're speaking about it openly. We're going to put him in jail. We're going to lock him up. And that way we're going to keep him from being in the office.
Well, then, I use this analogy a couple times publicly. But so what's interesting to me about toddlers, and, I've talked with Tucker Carlson about this. Toddlers lie in a way that's very different from how everybody else lies, right? So like if you're telling a lie, normally, hey, did you do that thing? you would say, no, somebody else did it, or they kind of qualified a little bit. Let me give you an example. My 4-year-old, I'm a big baker, probably surprised by that, but I'm a big baker. And my 4-year-old and I are making an Oreo cake a few weeks ago. And my 4-year-old is helping me. He likes to help me out a lot when I bake. And I go to the bathroom, and the Oreos that we're supposed to put in the Oreo cake, like crumble them up and put them in the cake, like half of them are gone when I get back. And I'm like, buddy, what happened to the Oreos? And he looks at me, and without a hint of irony or shame, he says, I didn't eat the Oreos, you did. Right? So that's the way that Kamala Harris lies, is I didn't eat the Oreos, you did. Not only does she actively brag, and has her administration actively bragged about trying to arrest her political opponents, she will go out and say that if Donald Trump is the president, he's going to arrest his political opponents, even though he already was president and he didn't do that.
Did you see she went on Shannon Sharp and said that he's going to take away your Second Amendment rights?
It's crazy. The person who literally wants to confiscate firearms, Kamala Harris, is saying that Donald Trump wants to take away your Second Amendment rights. Dude, the thing that, okay, do you know who Steve Bannon is?
Yes.
Okay, fascinating guy.
Didn't he just get out?
He got out of prison yesterday. They have the audacity to say Donald Trump wants to jail his political opponents. Steve Bannon just got out of prison after a 4-year prison sentence yesterday. And by the way, do you know what he was put in jail for? Do you know the actual charge?
No.
Contempt of Congress. Eric Holder, who was Obama's attorney general, was found in contempt of Congress, or at least was, there was, Congress found him in contempt. It was never litigated. He was never tried to put in jail. There was no court case around it. The contempt of Congress that Steve Bannon engaged in is that the J6 committee, or one of these, Banana Republic committees from the congressional Democrats, they issued him a subpoena. He, under the advice of his lawyers, felt that he couldn't actually respond to the subpoena because executive privilege applied. They held him in contempt of Congress, and they threw him in prison for it. A charge that has been levied against multiple Democrats. Republicans never tried to throw anybody in prison over it. Steve Bannon just got out of prison. Kamala Harris is literally using the power of government, has already used the power of government to jail her political opponents, and she's saying that Donald Trump is going to do the thing that he didn't do and she did when they were in respective positions of power.
Do you think it's because they're worried that if he gets into power and he gets back into the office, that he's going to start investigating a lot of this stuff and the 51 former intelligence agents?
That's exactly what they're afraid of. Yeah. They're afraid of consequences. They're afraid of, and look, do I think the 51 intelligence agents who signed that letter should go to prison? No, but should they be stripped of their security clearance? Absolutely, I do. Right? They lied. They used their position of authority and lied to the American people about something that was in the national interest. If there are no consequences for that, then what are we doing?
And they're probably very concerned with a trial that's going to reveal what the elements of that particular story really were. Like
there's a lot of corruption there. There are, I'm sure, higher ups. There are people who said one thing in public but said something else in private. There probably is, at some level of that whole thing, people who maybe perjured themselves or at least unethically lied. Look, there's a lot going on there, but Donald Trump is not going out there and has never said, I want to arrest you because you're a Democrat. He's never said, I want to arrest you because you disagree with me. He's never said, I want to censor you even because you engage in disinformation. What he has said is that we should investigate some of the obvious sources of corruption in the United States government. That's not going after your political opponents. That's what Kamala Harris did, actually.
Well, one of the things that he's talked about pretty openly is that he could have gone after Hillary Clinton and he didn't because he thought it would look bad for the country.
Yes.
And it's true. I mean, he really could have. She did commit crimes.
The FBI, a Democrat who's supporting Kamala Harris, said that she committed, I think, not just crimes, but maybe felonies. She committed felonies, and what Donald Trump did is said, you know what, it's bad for the country. A lot of my voters would love me to prosecute Hillary Clinton, but it's bad for the country, so I'm not going to do it. That is the exact opposite, of course, of what Kamala Harris and Joe Biden have done. And again, the media, it's a total upside-down universe where they accuse us of doing the very thing that they've done themselves.
Yeah, it's really wild to watch. It's the gaslighting is off the charts. So there's a bunch of things that people are deeply concerned with in this country. And it seems like for men, it's the economy. That seems like the primary thing that people are concerned with. And it seems like for a lot of women, it's abortion.
Sure.
Abortion and Roe v. Wade is a big concern.
Yeah.
Now, if I'm correct, your position, and this is what they wanted when they overturned Roe v. Wade, they wanted to leave it in control of the states. Is this your position?
Yeah, so what President Trump has said, and what I've said, is abortion is now a matter for state legislatures, state voters to determine. And I mean, one, that's always what the argument was, right? If Roe versus Wade goes away, then the state legislatures, the state populations are going to make each individual abortion decision the same way that, like, California has different laws on a whole host of subjects than Alabama does. The idea is that, California would make its own abortion policy, Alabama would make its own abortion policy. And so there's a basic sort of principle of federalism at work there. But I also think that, knowing Donald Trump well, I think he's motivated also by desire for us to just stop having a culture war over this particular issue and to let the voters in these states make these decisions while the national government focuses on things like lowering the cost of groceries and lowering the cost of housing and securing the southern border. And I think there's actually some great wisdom in that because, think about this. Abortion has not really been a political issue for 50 years. Now, we say that it is, and obviously we disagreed about it and people fought about it. It was always something the Supreme Court said, this is the way it is. There's no political decision-making. Every European nation has made abortion policy democratically. And that's what Donald Trump is saying. Do what every European nation has done. Let the voters decide what their abortion policy is going to be. And we're going to focus the national government on different things. And I say this as somebody who, I genuinely, want people to choose life. And I'm, a big believer in families. And I think, having children has been like a revelatory experience for me. And I want our country to be more pro-family, more pro-child. I think there are all these things that we can do at the federal level to make our country more pro-family and more pro-child, make childcare easier, I've actually sponsored legislation to stop the surprise medical bills that happen when people, and I've seen this with my own wife, you go to the hospital, you come home, you've got a beautiful baby, but you've also got a $20,000 unexpected bill because you choose the wrong out-of-network healthcare provider when you're at the moment of delivering a baby. Like, there are all these things we can do to make it easier for young women, young families to choose life. But Donald Trump, I think, wants abortion policy, and he said this explicitly, to be decided at the state level.
It's not possible for me to get pregnant. So when I think about these things, according to some people, depends on who you ask. But I think when you talk...
You get with the 21st century, man. It's possible for a man to get pregnant now.
For most people, I think one of the issues is, or for a lot of people, one of the issues is that men are making decisions for what women can and can't do.
I hear that.
And one of the more concerning aspects of this is, like, say if you live in a state like Texas, where there's a limit to when you can get an abortion. I think it's like 6 weeks, which a lot of people think at that point in time, you can't even tell whether or not you're pregnant. And this puts a lot of women in, like, very vulnerable positions. And then there's this thought that they could go to another state where it is legal and have an abortion, but they could be possibly prosecuted for that in their state. That's concerning to me, that we can make, if there's a place in the country where it's legal to have a medical procedure and you live in a state where it's not legal, that your state can decide what you can and can't do with your body, which is essentially based on a religious idea. And a lot of I'm not criticizing it one way or another, but I'm saying that a lot of what this choose life thing is about, that life is precious and life is sacred and life begins at the moment of conception. And some people agree with this, but other people disagree with this. And it seems to be a lot of it is based in religion. My concern is using that to dictate whether or not a person can legally travel to another state. I don't think the government should be monitoring where you travel or what you do when you travel, as long as that thing is legal. And I'm concerned with this idea that you could be prosecuted for it in your state for doing something that's legal somewhere else.
I don't like the idea, to be clear. I've not heard of this maybe as like a possibility, but not as something that actually exists in the law. But I've not heard of somebody being arrested, and I don't like the idea of arresting people for moving about the country.
I haven't heard of them doing it either. I've heard of the discussion.
I've heard it as a threat.
Yes.
I don't like the idea, to be clear, of people getting arrested for freely moving around the country.
Right.
I think, so to your point about it being a religious idea, I mean, I would say I know a number of non-religious people who are very pro-life. And I think the honest answer is that what we're doing is we're trying to figure out what is the right balance between autonomy and life. And I say this as somebody who, when Ohio made this decision, I campaigned very aggressively for the more pro-life position in the state of Ohio, and my side lost. In fact, we got our asses kicked. We lost 60-40. And I took some learning from that. I think one of the things that I took as a learning, as a guy who cares about this issue, is Republicans, we've got to earn the people's trust, because they don't trust the idea that when we say that we're pro-family, we don't just mean pro-birth. A lot of people say you're pro-birth, but you're not actually pro-family. And I think there's a lot that we can do as Republicans to try to earn back the trust of the American people. But if I'm trying to represent as fairly as I can the pro-choice and the pro-life position, here's what I think is really going on, is you have something. Now, some people would say, maybe religiously motivated, maybe not, that it's a human life. I would say that it's a human life, but it at least has the potential to be human life. And then on the other hand, you have, again, I freely recognize this, you have a woman who wants to make a choice about what she wants to do with her own body. Those are two very profound values, both of which I think are valuable, right? I mean, I think autonomy is really important. I also think life is really important. And what we're trying to talk about fundamentally, I think, again, I'm trying to be fair to both sides here, is to balance the interest in life against the interest in autonomy. And I think that the way to do that, at least my view, is to let the American people debate and talk about and argue about this issue and come to this decision on a state-by-state basis. And again, California, Florida, Ohio, Alabama, we're going to have different solutions to this particular problem. But that's what we're trying to do, right? People like me are trying to say, look, I think life really matters. And other people are trying to say, I think autonomy really matters. And the truth is that 95% of Americans would probably say there's some way to strike the balance in the middle. You know, where most of Europe has ended up here, and it's actually striking because you think of Europe, again, as a more socially liberal place than America. Almost every place in Europe has ended up effectively where late-term abortion outside of cases of medical necessity is banned outright. And then, you know, early-stage abortion is allowed. That's how most societies that democratically settle on this, that's how they strike the balance. I think my attitude is I'm running for vice president. I'm not trying to tell you how to strike the right balance, but we want to preserve the right of states to make these decisions.
I think what people are afraid of is men telling women what they can and can't do with their bodies.
That's the autonomy value.
Yeah.
I get it, man.
Yeah.
I get it. And I think that there is a very real and valid argument here that autonomy should take precedence here. But I also think, if we're being honest, there is an argument that life matters too. And that's the balance that people are trying to strike.
It's very complex, and
It's
people
super
don't want to
complicated.
look at it that way. I always discuss, when I talk about abortion, I say it's one of these very human issues where
That's
it's
right.
very strange, where most people think, like, at the moment of conception, if you could just remove those cells and keep them from multiplying, that's less bad than if you wait 6 months.
Right.
Like, almost everybody would agree to that. So what are we doing then? Like,
Right.
Bill Burr has a great bit about it.
Yeah,
Have you seen Bill Burr's bit?
it's a very good bit.
It's fantastic.
And there is a moral intuition there that obviously, like, something that looks and feels like a baby is more valuable than
Right.
you know, something that's just
Well,
looks
when
like
it has a
clump.
heartbeat, you
Something
can
has
see-
a heartbeat, sure.
look-
But I think it's just hard, right? Because it's not clear to me philosophically where you draw the line here. It's a very hard question to figure out, and I think that's why people debate it and disagree about it so vociferously. But it's interesting, man. The thing that I find, again, as a person who leans more in the pro-life side of this debate, is okay. So you will sometimes hear people on the left say, "Well, late-term abortion doesn't happen." Well, there's an organization called the Guttmacher Institute. It's a pro-choice organization. It's a abortion rights organization. And they found that there are approximately, I think it's 12,000 abortions that happen in the second half of pregnancy. So this is past 20 weeks, maybe it's even past 22 weeks. About 12,000 abortions past 22 weeks, okay? They also found that of those, 8,000 of them are purely elective. There's no medical necessity. There's no the baby has some genetic abnormality. It's just pure elective late-term abortion. I don't know how we can't get consensus that that is not good.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Come on. And in fact,
Especially when it's not a medical necessity.
exactly, every European nation has gotten to that point where you say, okay, 8,000 late-term abortions, come on. But again, it's not my decision as the vice president, and that's not President Trump's view. He's very against a national abortion ban because he wants this debate to happen organically and democratically. And I think that's kind of our attitude to this. Now, you're right. Again, there is a balance to strike here, but usually in American society, we recognize the way to strike that balance is to debate it as citizens and not to have lawyers and judges make these determinations for us.
Believe it or not, Joe Biden had one of the most logical takes on it a long time ago, back when he could talk real
Back
good.
when his brain wasn't fried?
And he said abortion should be safe, legal, and rare.
Well, that was my grandmother's view, right? That was my grandmother's view. That was the Bill Clinton view.
Yeah.
And I do think that there's something that is really weird about this whole debate where, thank God, to be clear, this is not true of the gross majority of our pro-choice citizens. But you do sometimes see people, they'll go on TikTok and they'll celebrate having an abortion.
Yeah.
I've known many, many women, usually when I was younger, who chose to have abortions because they felt like they didn't have any other options. And, I don't judge them. I think that a lot of them just felt like they were completely trapped, and they made the decision that was ultimately right for them. Again, my argument is we need to try to gain those women's trust back because clearly the Republican Party on this issue has lost a lot of trust, but none of them were baking birthday cakes and posting about it afterwards.
Right.
They recognize that this is a medical procedure and this is, something that they felt they had to do. But celebrating something like that is just bizarre to me. And I'm much more comfortable with the people who say safe, legal, rare than I am with the people who say let's shout our abortion from the rooftops.
Well, it's just this rebellion thing, and it's
Yeah,
also
no, that's
rebellion. Like the concept in the zeitgeist is that abortion had always been, Roe v. Wade had always been the law of the land, and then all of a sudden that was taken away, and you have these religious men who are trying to dictate what women can and can't do with their bodies.
Yeah. Yeah, no, look, I mean, again, I understand that. I understand the pushback against that, but I think you can go, like with so many other issues, you can go way too far about it, and it becomes trying to celebrate something that, at the very best, if you grant, I think, every argument of the pro-choice side, it is a neutral thing, not something to be celebrated.
I think there's very few people that are celebrating, though. It's just the extreme
100%
weirdos,
agree.
the TikTok
well, but it's
people.
Like everything,
Yeah,
right? Where and I try, this is something that is dangerous about social media, is the danger of social media with me is not, to me, that I live in my own echo chamber and just have views reinforced. The danger is that I'm only exposed to the crazy people on the other side who make it easier for me to adopt my own worldview because I'm saying, oh, it's just people celebrating. When in reality, like you said, most American women, even those who are pro-choice, are not celebrating this thing.
I think that's one of the insidious things about the social media algorithm is that it highlights things that people engage with.
The more outrageous.
Which is more outrageous, more things that they find reprehensible.
That's right.
They see more of it. I see so many guys with makeup telling me they're going to take your kids,
That's
they're going
right.
to indoctrinate your kids.
Yeah.
Like, why am I seeing that? Well, it's because they're highlighting it. And when you have an app that's owned by China, that is the number one app. Is that a coincidence?
That's facilitating the worst of our fellow citizens because it allows us to silo more. But I mean, the way that I deal with that is I just try as hard as I can to remember that most Americans, this is what really bothered me about what Biden said, like most Americans who vote for Kamala Harris are fundamentally good people. Like I believe that. And you got to try to find the people who are reasonable and talk to them. And that's why I talk about, the importance of regaining trust is just I've had enough conversations with people who don't like the Republican Party's, even their perception of the Republican Party's views here, that if you talk to reasonable people, you gain a different perspective than if you talk to the unreasonable people. So I try to do that.
And I think a lot of people are only informed by headlines and by real quick things that they see on television. And so they form these narratives in their head, and this is what they're operating off of.
That's absolutely right.
And this is why they have this weird perception of both Republicans and of Trump. And then they start throwing these terms around like fascism and white supremacy. And, well, of course you don't like fascism. Of course you don't like white supremacy. You can't be a Republican. And the next thing you know, you're on the other side. And you know, like, how did you get me? You railroaded me, you fucks.
Yeah,
and you guys you're censoring my Facebook. What's going on here? And there's not like a reasonable, and that's the one thing that I think the Republican Party has done poorly is like be a little bit more balanced in some of these controversial social issues. Like the one thing that people were worried about right after Roe v. Wade was gay marriage and gay marriage laws. And people were thinking, well, it's religion that overturned Roe v. Wade, and religion is probably going to overturn these gay marriage laws. And people are very terrified about that, too.
Yeah, and which obviously that's not something we're trying to do. But it's interesting to me that how much people focus on the religious element of it. Because if you go back to the Roe versus Wade debate, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was a feminist icon and was very pro-choice, she thought Roe versus Wade was terrible law.
Why did she think that?
Because, basically because of the argument that often, sort of Republicans will use about making it a state issue is she said, look, you can be pro-choice as Ruth Bader Ginsburg was, but the avenue to make abortion policy should be legislatures, not judges. So it was a procedural argument about how the Constitution functioned, where it's funny, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg actually agreed with Donald Trump that even if, that this should be a state's issue, that the states should make these decisions among their citizens. And it's telling that perspective is not illustrated or highlighted. But look, I understand, like, people who aren't, I'm obviously a person of faith, they don't want people of faith to force their values down on people who don't agree with them. But I'm sort of comfortable with every one of us kind of having our zone. And within that zone, I don't want people to come in and tell me what to do. Like in my home, I'd like to be able to raise my kids with my religious values, and I'd like to be able to teach my kids what I think, and you should be able to teach your kids what you think. And then we recognize that the more public the zone, the less that I can get to control what you do. And that's part of living in a pluralistic society, and I'm very comfortable with that. I think, unfortunately, the modern left seems to be less and less comfortable even with people of faith having their own private zone. Right? This is the trans thing where it's like, oh, we're going to take your kids away if you don't consent to gender reassignment. Or, we're going to tell you that you can't send your kids to a religious school. You hear people say these things. Again, I think it's the crazies. It's not the majority of our fellow citizens. But part of living in a pluralistic society is accepting that every man's castle or every woman's castle is his or her own. You've got to have respect for people within those castles. And then we should hopefully just have some common sense things that everybody can agree on when we're talking about public spaces.
I think for a lot of people, worst case scenario, when they start thinking about religious influence on the way they're allowed to behave and the way their state is governed. Worst case scenario is a state adopts Sharia law. This is worst case scenario.
Yep.
And I think all these people that would cry against the concept of Islamophobia really need to understand what that means and what you're talking about. And to say that that's an outrageous and ridiculous idea that's never going to take place, it's kind of already worked its way into some societies.
It has.
It has.
It has.
And there are, is it Minnesota that has call to prayer? Like, is it Minneapolis?
I don't know where.
Place,
I know that there is a place in Minnesota, I believe, where they have prayer calls as a matter of local government. I do think that's happening.
That starts getting real weird.
Yeah. Well,
stuff like that starts getting real weird. And when you have people that are openly saying our goal is, and they've talked about this in Toronto, like activists have said, our goal is to outbreed everyone who is not Muslim and vote it out and put Sharia law in place.
Yeah, that's very scary.
Women have to wear burqas. This is how it works.
Yeah. Well, and that's what to me is so crazy about some of the hyper left-wing reaction to, the idea that like somehow I want to force every man, woman, child to go to my church is ridiculous. I just don't want to do that. I've never had any interest in doing that. But where you see actual real religious tyranny is increasingly in Western societies where you've had a large influx of immigrants who don't necessarily assimilate into Western values, but try to create, I think, a religious tyranny at the local level. And if you think that won't happen at a national level, you're crazy.
Did you ever read Douglas Murray's book, The Strange Death of Europe?
I haven't read the whole thing, but I've read it in bits and pieces. He's
It's
a smart guy.
He got attacked so hard for that because he was really like an early sounder. He's the Paul Revere of this shit.
Well, no, one of the most controversial things I've ever said is, what is the first Islamist? Right, because it's important to separate. There are Muslims who are not Islamists, right? Islamists are like theocrats,
right?
What is the first Islamist country that is going to have a nuclear weapon? And I sort of joked. I said maybe it's going to be the United Kingdom because they're so bad at assimilating sort of newer immigrants into their society. You have definitely communities in the UK where local leaders are running explicitly on Sharia law and winning elections in cities that are in the United Kingdom, right? This is England. This is like where America came from, right? It's a bunch of English pilgrims who came to the United States. That, to me, is really crazy and really scary. And then, of course, everybody said, well, Pakistan already has nuclear weapons. And my response is, well, Pakistan isn't necessarily an Islamist country. It's an Islamic country. They certainly have an Islamic government, and that's the majority religion of the people. But Pakistan isn't going and saying we need to conquer the infidels. At least their government isn't. We need to conquer the infidels and force them to obey our laws. You see that more among some of the activists in the United Kingdom, maybe than you do in certain Arab countries. And that's crazy.
It is crazy, but it goes along with this thing that we've been talking about. I think essentially people have sort of a built-in mode, a program in their mind that accepts religious doctrines. And these religious doctrines could be woke, it could be hardcore right-wing conservative Christian fundamentalism, or it could be Islamic doctrine. But
but this is why assimilation is so important, right? That, look, I'm married to the daughter of immigrants. I do think that immigration can enrich this country. I do think that immigrants, many of them, are bringing a lot of to the table. But we have to be honest with ourselves that permitting 500,000 immigrants in a society like ours is much different than permitting 5 million or 50 million immigrants. And importantly, where are the immigrants coming from? What are their values? What are their economic skills? There's something.
What's their criminal record?
What's their criminal record? There's something very in sort of the modern. Again, this is a new thing because this is not Bill Clinton liberalism. This is something that we're seeing today where they don't even want to talk about the quality and the backgrounds and the skills of people coming into our country. Somehow it's fundamentally racist to say, well, we don't want certain people of certain backgrounds to be in the United States of America. No, it's just common sense. I mean, let me sort of give you a very specific example, okay? So, ask yourself, should America accept 100,000 immigrants from Mexico, okay? Just in the abstract. Well, Mexico is a gigantic country with millions upon millions of people. Who are we talking about? Are we talking about people who speak English as a second language and don't have criminal backgrounds? Or are we talking about people who don't even read and write in Spanish and do have criminal backgrounds? Because those same groups of people, even though they come from the country we call Mexico, are going to assimilate and contribute to America's society much differently. There's something in the modern liberal mind that doesn't even allow you to ask the question, who does America benefit from bringing into this country? And if the answer is we don't benefit, then why would we bring them into the country?
Well, it's also the concept of being anti-open border somehow or another became attached instead of safety. It became attached to xenophobia.
Yes.
It became attached to racism. And when you confront people and say, "Do you know that Venezuela is literally opening their prisons and instructing people to just cross into America?"
Yes.
Like, no. When you tell one of the wildest ones, I think it was you, were having a conversation with a woman. We were discussing the gangs in Aurora, Colorado that have
That was
taken
me. Yeah.
And she was like, "It's only a couple buildings."
And imagine if that's your community. It's only a couple of apartment complexes, right, with hundreds of people that have been taken over by Venezuelan gangs. I think, Joe, the right number
Is
of
zero.
apartment complexes taken over by Venezuelan gangs is zero.
It's in San Antonio, too. It's happening in San Antonio.
It's happening everywhere.
It's so crazy that people don't want to admit to this because if they do, it's empowering the right.
Yep.
And they think it's going to help Donald Trump get elected. So they're turning a blind eye to dangerous criminals crossing the border with no recourse, no tracking. You can't do anything about it.
Well, you see this in some communities where, because they're small towns and because rapid migrant influx can happen very quickly, where the town population has been doubled. Okay, so you don't even have to assume people are criminals. What does it do to the local public school when all of a sudden 1,000 newcomers show up that don't even speak English? Right? What does it do to the hospital system when you now have thousands of people in a small healthcare system that are showing up to get emergency services because they don't have access otherwise to a doctor, and now the American citizens have to wait in line for 7 hours to get to see a doctor because we've overwhelmed the local hospital system? What does it do to housing prices? We've seen this in a number of communities, including those that I represent in Ohio. When you bring in thousands upon thousands of people, you cannot build enough houses quickly enough to accommodate that, so the cost of housing becomes unaffordable for American citizens. It is the craziest thing that we've seen in this country, that you don't even allow people to talk about the effects of mass migration anymore.
Right.
And that's why I think it's one of the reasons why Donald Trump is going to be elected president, or at least should be elected president, because he's one of the few guys who's saying, you know what, no, we're going to talk about this problem. Yes, some immigrants are good. Some immigrants are not good, and that is an obvious insight to anybody who knows human nature.
What do you think is the goal behind allowing this to take place? Now, first of all, one of the things that Kamala Harris has said was that there was a bill that could have fixed the border problem, but that Donald Trump did not want it to take place because he wanted to keep this as a political talking point.
Totally dishonest. Totally dishonest.
What was the bill?
Okay, here was the bill. What happened is, okay, let me talk about what the bill does, first of all. Okay. Number one is it sets a maximum cap on the number of illegal immigrants that we can have before the border shuts down. That maximum cap is 2 million illegal aliens per year. It's like 1.85 million, to be more precise. That's number one it did. Number two, it codified what's called catch and release, where a person comes into our country, they're an illegal immigrant, but they say, no, I'm not an illegal immigrant, I'm an asylum seeker. And so their claim for asylum gets adjudicated, but because there's a backlog, because we have so many, their claim isn't going to be adjudicated for 15 years. So rather than having that person wait in Mexico, we give them a work permit, and we give them legal status, and we let them come into the United States of America. That's called catch and release. Donald Trump's policy was you have to wait in Mexico. We're not going to catch you and then release you into the country for 15 years. It codified that. In other words, even if Donald Trump became president, and this was why he really hated it, is that he would not be able to undo catch and release if he won the election.